All right, well, next up, we're going to keep things moving. We welcome in Ellen Powell, the CEO of Project Include. Ellen's mission is to give everyone a fair chance to success with a goal for better innovation and improved companies. Powell uses an approach centralized and informed by data. And in this next session, she hopes to drive home practical, inspiring, and achievable goals for a better future for everyone. Ellen is going to be joined by Merrilee Matchett. Merrilee is the head of MetLife's Global Customer Service and Operations Group. And in her role, she's got a lot going on. She directs a team of more than 10,000 associates responsible for managing the operations and servicing teams that support and enable U.S. group benefits, retirement and income solutions, MetLife Holdings, and Asia, EMEA, and Latin America businesses across more than 40 global markets. Merrilee, I'm going to send it over to you.
Thank you, Katie. Ellen, welcome. We're so excited that you're here with us today. And they were mentioning earlier about the passion in the room in Cary. So I'd invite everyone here in corporate head office to join me in giving a very warm New York welcome to Ellen Powell. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to having a great conversation today around some of the most pressing issues that are facing women in today's STEM workforce. And Ellen, you've had an impressive career, and Katie referenced some of that in tech, from a long-time entrepreneur, investor, C-suite leader, and throughout a real champion in diversity and inclusion. And you've constantly brought attention to the ongoing issues in gender parity in tech, and not just called attention to, but you've constantly been involved in actively identifying solutions to gender parity issues. And I think creating a safe space in which to have difficult conversations, it's absolutely essential in how we move forward from a diversity, equity and inclusion perspective. And it's certainly something that we're very committed to here in MetLife. And I love that thread that goes through your career in that regard. So why don't we just jump in? I'm keen to get started if you're ready.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I hope this won't be a difficult conversation.
That it is a safe place. So let's begin with your time in venture capital in tech and that experience that you had in that period in your career. You're working with Kleiner Perkins. What prompted you to take a stand?
It was an interesting experience for me because I had grown up being in this world where I had thought that it was a meritocracy. So when I got feedback, I would try to act on it. And I was very focused on me being the problem and trying to fix myself to fit into this world that where over time I began to see was not actually that fair. We would hire people, but there would never be a Black or Latinx candidate, and there would be only 1 or 2 women out of a field of 25 applicants that we brought in. Over time, I began to see more patterns, and then there was one point where, where it was very crystal clear in my mind when there was a round of promotions into the next fund in venture capital. You raise funds, and then people get promoted into different roles in the funds. So for Fund 15, almost all of the men got promoted, and not a single woman. And it just became clear, wow, this is actually a pattern, because I could see some of the men being promoted, but not almost all of them. And then I could see some of the women not being promoted, but not all of them. So it became very clear to me that this was a much bigger problem. And then as more problems surfaced, we started talking, and one woman said she had talked to a bunch of women at other venture capital firms, and they had all been harassed and had problems and weren't getting promoted. And then, then I started hearing, once I sued and it became public, I started hearing from people from other industries and realized this is just a huge prevalent problem where there's a lot of discrimination, there's a lot of harassment, and it's just not fair for women and for people from other marginalized groups, right? So it's an issue of exclusion on so many different levels.
And you reference in your book that whilst at the time the case wasn't successful, a tremendous amount of positivity has come from that. And you just lightly touched on that when you said you started to hear from other people. Can you talk a little bit more around that?
It started to make this conversation more open. So there would be people who would come up to me and say, I had a similar experience. Or, men would come up to me and say, oh, my mom had the experience of being promoted, but being shuttled to a broom closet. And your story of being put in an office in, the remote nether regions of your building resonated with me because that happened to my mom. Or, like different people had different parts of my story that connected with them because they knew it happened to them or it had happened to somebody else, and they were now able to talk about it because it was something that before people would internalize or they wouldn't feel comfortable talking about it. There's a whole culture of secrecy and blame and victimization. One woman came to me and said, I had been harassed. I didn't even tell my husband because I felt so much shame around it. So so people started having these conversations, and tech had been this world, like I had believed it was, that, had this mystique of being this meritocracy, and you could come from nothing and become a billionaire, and all of a sudden people started to talk about tech as not being a meritocracy. When I first sued, there was an article in the New York Times, and I've had a nice conversation with the reporter since, but it was very hurtful to me personally because, he interviewed somebody who said, oh, I wrote a book about Silicon Valley, and if this were actually a problem, somebody would have mentioned it, so I'm skeptical, right? Nobody was talking about it because they knew the response would be so negative. And for me to bring it up and for it to get so much attention really helped other people start telling their stories. And really it became a change in attitude and a change in understanding of how the world of venture and the world of tech actually worked.
And that's so powerful what you just said there around it started to make it okay to talk about it. Yeah. And that's just so important, and what I appreciate must have been such a difficult time. It was so widely covered in the press, and it coined the term, the power effect, and it really revolutionized Silicon Valley in being able to talk about what people were experiencing in and of itself. And if we look back over the last decade in venture capital and tech, what change do you see when it comes to women in the workplace?
I think there's an awareness and an attitude that's really changed. There's an awareness that there are these problems. Like, for a long time, myself included, like if somebody said, no, that's a you problem, like you need to change in this way, you're too ambitious, you shouldn't be looking for that promotion, or you don't deserve it. There are these patterns now that we can understand. Oh, it's actually not you. Like if you looked at Kleiner, like the women had more education, more work experience, more time at Kleiner compared to the men, but they were told they weren't ready, right? So you can look at it from a pattern perspective and realize, oh, that's actually not true. I'm not less experienced. I'm not less educated. I'm not less likable, right? You can all of a sudden understand there are patterns in how people are treated, and those patterns are systemic, and it's a systemic problem, and it's not an individual problem. And I think that understanding makes it, in some ways, it makes it a lot easier because you understand what's going on and you don't have to take it personally, but it also makes it harder because where can you go to have a better work experience, to be given all the opportunities that you deserve? You can find places that are better, but it's hard to find we're all evolving and we're all getting better, but it's not, there's no one company where I'd say, oh, this is a place where everybody's going to have a great experience.
Yeah, I think it's a cosmic shift in and of itself to move from what I'm lacking to what am I looking for and what do I want and where do I find what I want, which is great. And I guess a follow-up question, if we just stay on that theme for a little while, would be, what difference do you see in how people talk about bias in the workplace?
I think that, like, when Project Include started out, it was in response to this this wave of bias training, where companies would do an hour and a half of what they called unconscious bias training, and then they do a big PR release about how they've solved everything. So at that point in time, people believed that it was like this small problem, a checkbox solution, go do training, and then you're done. And I think today people realize, like, these are biases that are societal, that are built in, that are ingrained, that are reinforced but through school, through the workplace, through the media, and you can't just change it with an hour and a half training. It may impact you for a little while, but it's like an ongoing change that that is, that takes time, and it takes these difficult conversations, and it takes, self-awareness and kind of acknowledging, your own biases. And that is not something that is going to be solved overnight. It's not something that our processes are always designed to deal with, and you need to do a lot of work to get to a point where bias has less impact.
And I think during your career, Ellen, you've held many impressive titles, one of them being CEO at Reddit. And in your book, you made an observation. You said that you didn't always feel included. Can you share with us what you experienced that led you to make that observation during that time?
At Reddit, we were in a mode of like constant change, and there were a lot of things that we did that were not accepted then, and we had to kind of band together to push these changes through. There was one person who I work with, and when I took on the CEO role, it was through a time of chaos, and he was like, "I'm going to be your partner through this. We're going to make these changes together. We're going to work together and push through." And then I later found out he was meeting behind the scenes with the board, which eventually asked me to leave, to kind of, my understanding is that he was part of the people trying to push me out. And that was something where, on the face, he was super supportive, and we're in this together as a team. And then behind the scenes, he was not at all supportive. And that kind of experience, I think, is true for a lot of people. Like, you get excluded from meetings where decisions are being made, and sometimes those decisions are, and it's sometimes intentional, sometimes it's not intentional, but it has an impact on your career. And in my case, they pushed me out. So it was a very direct impact. But I think it's something that you need to, now that I'm aware of, I try to get into those meetings, but often at the time they're trying to hide it from you. So it's a very, it's a hard thing to deal with, because how do you constantly jam your way into meetings where you're not wanted?
And you're talking about such an important theme of inclusion, and you often hear inclusion is the poor cousin to diversity. What do you think as leaders we should be doing to ensure that the actions we're taking to foster diversity and inclusion actually includes inclusion?
Yeah, I think a big part of it is kind of just changing the way you think about, basically it's like everything that you do, right? Mm-hmm. Like, who is going to be harmed by this, right? Is the kind of basic thing. Like, who's not going to be able to participate, and why? And are there ways that we can make sure that the person who has the hardest time participating doesn't have the hardest time participating? So if we're doing something at a time when families are eating dinner, like, that's actually probably not good for parents. Or if we're doing something that involves a lot of walking, that's probably not good for people who are disabled. If we're doing, like, how are these things going to be not inclusive? And let's think about it from every step of the way.
And I love what you just said there, which is the people who have the hardest time being included, what are you actively doing to help them?
And often that helps everybody.
It absolutely does. I love that. So if we just extend our thinking now around inclusion, I'd love to talk about Project Include. So you've founded this non-profit company that's really focused on identifying and accelerating diversity and inclusion solutions, working with some of the biggest tech companies in the game, with the CEOs and the boards. Can you talk a little bit more about why you founded it and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, well, I love talking about Project Include because it's been such a big part of my life for the past few years. We started in like 2015. I started having conversations. I had been pushed out of Reddit and had started talking to friends about, and a lot of it was just kind of frustration at, companies, every week there'd be another company announcing their unconscious bias training. And, we would talk about, wow, this is actually such a non-solution, and it's actually harmful in many ways, because now people think that they're inclusive, and it's not the fact. Like, what would we want companies to actually do? So 8 of us sat down from all different backgrounds, but all women, to come up with a list of what we thought companies should do. And over the course of a few months, we came up with 87 things. So we put it on a website. So, the idea is it's not like a checkbox thing. It's really, what are the frameworks you need to think about, and how are you supposed, how should you be making these decisions, and what are the different ways that you should be involving people from other groups in how you're making decisions, and thinking about people's other perspectives and how you're building an organization and building the processes, and how do you think about a whole employee's life cycle. It's not just about hiring people, but it is this inclusion part that's so important. Otherwise, you're just going to bring people in and have them leave, or bring people in and force them out. So kind of thinking about every step of every process, like how should you be thinking about it? We can't predict every decision you're going to make, so we don't want to make a checklist, and every company is somewhat different. How do you start thinking about making decisions better?
One of the things I was particularly interested in the solutions that you help tech companies with, they're grounded in 3 key values of inclusion, accountability, and comprehensiveness. Why do you think those 3 values are particularly important?
We spend a lot of time thinking about like what's the basic framework? Like if people don't read, all 87 recommendations, like what are the 3 things we want them to be thinking about as they go through? And the first one was inclusion of everyone. So, a lot of efforts will look at, one group, and then it becomes still exclusive, but they'll bring in a few members of that group into the inner group, not all of the activities, but some of the activities, and they continue to have an exclusive culture. And it's not really inclusive, but they feel better about it because they've checked the box. Oh, I've got 2 white women in my executive team, so now I look better, I feel better, and I'm done. But it's really about, I'm thinking about including people on my engineering team. I'm thinking about including people from different races, from different sexual orientations, from different levels of disability. How do I think about every group and make my whole organization inclusive of everyone? So this concept of inclusion as being very broad. And then the second value is comprehensiveness. So it's not just hiring people, but it's thinking about how you promote them, how you give them visibility, how you give them opportunities, how you pay them, right? So it's not just one part of your company, it's all of your companies. It's really a shift in culture. And then the third part is, none of this happens if you don't treat it as a business imperative. So like every other business imperative, you need accountability, and you need to use metrics to, make sure that people are being held accountable. Like if we decide we want to be inclusive, like, is your team actually diverse? Are they being given opportunities? Do they feel like they're included? How do we, make sure that we're measuring it, and then, the things that we've done, like if they're not actually helping the problem, then we should stop doing them. Or if something's working, we should do more of that. And it allows companies to experiment, right? You don't have to have everything work. It's okay to try something new and have it fail. That's progress, right? You're trying and you're learning, and then you're going to do something else.
Do you have an example that you could share with us of one of the companies that's implemented your recommendations and the results that's come from that to bring that to life?
We keep the information about our companies private, but I will tell you about a CEO who had a great experience. He started out with like 6, I think, white men on the team, and he realized, wow, if I hire one more white man, it's going to make it that much harder to hire the next person. It's already been hard to bring in somebody who doesn't look like them. How do I bring in, like, how do I make that happen longer term if I keep doing it the wrong way? So he really went out and he was great. He was like, my friends are not only white men, so I can think outside of the box and look through my LinkedIn connections and find lots of women, lots of people who are from different races and ethnicities to, and move them into the outreach that I personally make as CEO to try to bring people on board. I don't have to just bring in, the people that I hang out with. And from there, he kind of was like, actually, I don't really need ping pong tables on the website or, to highlight that as a thing, because that's going to be limiting to the kind of people that I attract. And from there, he went on and he was able to hire a team that was more diverse. And he realized, like, he liked going into the office more. Like, it felt more relaxed. It felt like people were more, there wasn't like that pressure to behave in a specific way. People could be themselves, and he could feel that it was a much better culture, one that he wanted to go in every day and participate in. And he also described what he called the flywheel effect. Once he had people from different backgrounds, more people from different backgrounds were interested in coming on board, and recruiting became a lot easier, and he was reaching like a different network of people who were looking for opportunities to work at companies like his. And he was just, really such an advocate of something that, started out as being like a very specific problem. And there were so many ways that it improved his company and improved his own experience that was just very inspiring.
I love it. You've been quoted as saying that one day you hope Project Include will become obsolete. What are the primary hurdles that have to be overcome to be able to send you on that early retirement?
I think the tech industry is going backwards in many ways. I think there are a lot of CEOs who are inclusive and who are thinking about these problems in a much broader, open-minded way. But a lot of the larger companies, and we look now at Elon Musk as the worst example of what you can do to a company. They're going backwards, right? They're digging in and they're like, oh, we don't like these uncomfortable conversations. We don't want to talk about work-life balance. We don't want to talk about people having kids. We don't want to talk about, having to, understand asking people to do a little bit more. We're just going to make this work all the time. Bring your sleeping bag into work, and you're going to be there. And if you're not hardcore, you're out. And that attitude, that fixed mindset, is so harmful. And the fact that he is the richest man in the world and has an impact on other people, it's taking things backwards. So I feel like this whole movement around, and we've seen. We've learned of other CEOs are talking about what a great role model he is, and that I think is highly problematic because we've made so much progress. We've decided that it's about the quality of the work and the work getting done, and not the quantity of hours, and not having everybody in the office. We've realized, wow, some people really benefit from the hybrid workplace, and I understand MetLife has really embraced it, and there's. And I think it works well for companies that are well managed. But if you're not a good manager, if you don't know how to measure whether your employees are productive or are getting what they need to do their jobs, then often you just look at FaceTime. You look at whether people are physically in the office, and that's your best metrics. And then your company's not going to succeed, and it's going to be problematic. But for right now, in this point in time, there's been kind of a return to that, and this idea that hours equals productivity in a way that isn't productive actually at all.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you've gone back to the tech industry. When we think about how we drive diversity and inclusion across tech, whose role is it to take the lead, and why?
Yeah, I think it's everybody's role, right? It should be a part of the culture. I think the person who needs to exemplify it the most, though, is the CEO, right? At the end of the day, the hard decisions go to the CEO. And we have this standard example in tech where, often there'll be this engineering star who, is great at solving hard problems or is able to get the code out to ship the product by, in time. And often they're problematic. It's like your spoiled brat, right? And they get to do what they want to, and often that's not, it's inappropriate office behavior, and it's something that, the engineering lead doesn't want to deal with, but this person might be harming people in other groups, and the decision ends up going up to the CEO, and the CEO has to decide, do I want to ship the product on time, or do I want to have a good culture? And often they end up siding with, I need to ship the product on time, and that bad behavior becomes like, oh, well, the star engineer has this bad behavior, it must be good, and it all of a sudden infiltrates the rest of your organization. So, if the CEO is not making the right decisions for the long term, you end up with a lot of bad behavior replicating itself and becoming a bigger and bigger problem. So I see the CEO as like the arbiter of the hard conversations. If they're avoiding these issues, if they don't want to have these hard conversations, if they're burying, diversity and inclusion at the bottom rungs of the organization because they don't want to deal with it. But like all of that is going to prevent these problems from being heard, from these conversations from being had, and from the right decisions being made.
Yeah. And as you know, the theme of our conference this year is driving the next innovation wave. What role do you see tech playing in solving some of the global challenges that we face today?
Yeah, I think a big role of tech is in communications, right? So, the fact that we can have this hybrid conference, and the fact that, we can, have Zoom conversations, that we can have these hybrid workplaces, a lot of that is coming through this ability to communicate. I think, we see, and talking about Twitter, like this ability to reach huge swaths of people that you don't even know. And I think that's like one of the fundamental roles of communication, that it's a huge tool, but it can also be used as a weapon. So to be very thoughtful about like, how are we implementing this tool? Yes, I can be in your bedroom 24 hours a day, but I don't think that makes sense for a workplace. Like, how do we set the boundaries and how do we set the norms for, really useful and meaningful engagement? And the same thing for social media. Like, how do we make sure that we're teaching people how to interact in a way that actually connects, where people are actually learning and where people are actually able to benefit instead of having this overall problems. And one of the things that we learned during COVID is that a lot of harms happen to people over remote work. So Project Include did research, and we looked at we surveyed over almost 3,000 people to learn how people were experiencing the workplace during the pandemic. And a lot of the harms that were happening were still happening. People were being harassed or treated hostilely over the phone or over one-on-one video chat. And it was something that came, it seems like, from a lot of the anxiety that was coming out of the pandemic, and it was being thrown onto coworkers. So, and we also realized that women and non-binary people were being disproportionately impacted. Black, Latinx, and Asian women especially, transgender people were being affected. So the marginalization of certain workers got even worse over technology. So technology can be a huge connector and a huge tool, but we have to be thoughtful about it, and we have to set norms, and we have to set expectations of behavior and be responsible.
Very thoughtful and purposeful.
Yeah.
With that. So I think, Ellen, what's the one piece of guidance or advice that you'd leave with our participants today, be it career or otherwise?
Yeah, I think the big thing that has helped me through so much is just know that you're right. Like, when you are doing something, you don't have to, there are some people who are just never going to believe you, right? Like, I could have a conversation with Elon Musk for days, and he's just, there's some things that we know is true, that there's racism in the workplace, that there's sexism in the workplace. Like, he's just not going to believe it. But I know what's true. I don't need to prove it to him, right? If you know yourself, what's true about yourself, what's true about what you're doing, what's true, that should be enough for you, and to get you through, to get to a place where other people, where you can find more people who agree with you, and don't feel like this burden that you have to prove it to everyone, and don't waste your energy on that when it might not work. But always know that you are right, and have that be that kind of guiding light that pushes you to do the right thing in the face of all of these, all of these conflicts.
I love that, and it's around that conviction, I think, and the confidence that comes from that, in terms of knowing that you're right versus thinking that to the world, and then letting that give you the courage to take action.
Yeah.
So I think just thank you. Thank you for your candor. Thank you for sharing not just your experience, but your insights. And I think it's just so unique that the insights that you share, because you've experienced navigating tech's culture at every level in the industry, but that perspective is combined through the work that you're doing now in working with some of the biggest tech companies in really looking to identify and accelerate diversity and inclusion solutions across the industry. And it's having these types of conversations that helps us continue to drive change in the industry. And I hope listening to Ellen today has inspired so many of you to be able to continue taking these conversations forward. So I think, Ellen, thank you for being with us. And Katie, with that, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you.